Usually when we talk about making a medical diagnosis, there is this fundamental expectation of precision.
Right, like it's a science.
Exactly. You think of it like engineering almost. You break your arm, the x-ray shows a jagged white line, and the doctor just points to the film and says, there it is, that's the problem.
It's totally binary, broken or not broken.
Yeah, it's clean, it's definitive, it gives you a clear path forward. But the moment you step out of the hospital and into the realm of history and geopolitics, that x-ray machine just completely shatters.
Oh, absolutely. The diagnostic landscape gets incredibly murky.
And today, we're unpacking what might just be the most spectacular, mind-bending misdiagnosis in the entire history of human philosophy.
It is the absolute pinnacle of muddy waters, primarily because the patient in question didn't just, defy the prognosis.
Right.
They fundamentally rewrote the medical textbook.
To make sense of this, we are diving into an incredibly rich stack of sources today.
Yeah, it's a fascinating mix.
We've got translated philosophical lectures from 19th century Germany, historical accounts of 15th century maritime armadas, and modern geopolitical white papers.
Detailing everything from global infrastructure to AI patents.
Exactly. And we're using all of this to look at a massive, ancient civilization. Imagine going back to the 1820s.
Okay.
The most famous, influential philosopher in the world at that time looks at this specific civilization and officially diagnoses it as being completely frozen.
Frozen, right.
He claims it is a society incapable of progress, trapped in a state of just eternal repetition. A civilization that, in his exact words, possesses no history.
Which is an astonishing claim to make about a society that had already been recording its own history for thousands of years.
Right, but the philosopher making that claim was Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel.
And this civilization he diagnosed as this permanently stationary artifact was China.
Now, cut to today. The exact same civilization that Hegel dismissed as frozen currently fields the world's largest navy by hull count.
Which is just wild to think about.
It's crazy. They are leading the planet in patent filings for quantum computing. They are the architects behind a global infrastructure network, and they are literally planting flags on the far side of the moon.
The paradox here is almost dizzying.
It really is. So what's our mission for this deep dive?
Well, it's the defining paradox of 21st century geopolitics. And our goal today isn't merely to point out that a 19th century European intellectual got the future wrong.
Because that would be too easy.
Way too easy. Instead, the source material offers this far more fascinating experiment. We are going to take Hegel's own philosophical framework.
The whole world spirit thing.
Exactly. This deeply complex system built on concepts like the world spirit and dialectical progress. We're going to use it as a lens to analyze China's astronomical rise.
Okay, I love this.
We are asking how his philosophical system would interpret the very transformation that proved his initial diagnosis wrong.
So we're using his own tools against his own theory.
Pretty much. By doing so, we uncover the hidden mechanics of how civilizations actually evolve, how technology transfers across the globe, and, where Western conceptual maps just fundamentally break down.
Think of it like this, for you listening. Imagine someone hands you a blueprint of an incredibly beautiful, intricately constructed clock.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The gears are perfect, the casing is magnificent, but the blueprint clearly shows that it is completely stationary. The gears are not designed to turn.
It's a monument, basically, not a machine.
Right, and then, a century later, you look up and that exact same stationary clock is somehow powering a deep space rocket.
That is a great way to put it.
Our mission today is to look at those historical blueprints, examine the modern rocket, and figure out exactly how and from where it got the engine.
And just a quick note before we jump in, to understand that engine, we have to explore these historical and political developments entirely objectively.
Yes, absolutely.
We are relying strictly on the provided source material to understand the structural shifts. We aren't endorsing any political viewpoints here.
We're just looking at the mechanics. So, to start, we have to plunge into the intellectual environment of the 1820s. We need to unpack Hegel's original snapshot.
He referred to China as the childhood of history.
Which, honestly, to our modern ears, sounds incredibly condescending.
Oh, it absolutely does.
It sounds like that casual Eurocentric arrogance you'd expect from the era.
But the philosophical texts we're analyzing suggest he wasn't just, throwing around insults.
He wasn't just being a jerk.
No, he was using a very specific technical vocabulary. He laid out this grand theory of human development in his lectures on the philosophy of history.
Delivered in the 1820s, right?
Between 1822 and 1831, yeah. He categorized China as the oldest state, but placed it at the absolute beginning of his timeline, the first, most primitive stage of world history.
The childhood.
Exactly. In his system, he argued that China embodied what he called the patriarchal theocratic principle.
Okay, let's break down patriarchal theocratic, because that feels like the linchpin of his whole diagnosis.
It really is. The foundational unit of Chinese society, in Hegel's reading, was the family.
Okay.
But this wasn't just a social dynamic, it was the governing logic of the entire universe. The emperor wasn't merely a chief executive or a politician.
Right, he's not a prime minister.
He was the living, undivided substance of the state itself. He was the ultimate patriarch.
So the dynamics of a strict traditional family are just projected fractally onto the entire civilization.
Where the father's word is absolute law and obedience is the highest virtue, yes.
So the state is essentially one gigantic household.
Exactly.
And if the state is a family, the citizens are permanently categorized as children. They never reach the age of majority.
They never get a seat at the table to debate the rules of the house.
That is fascinating.
And that leads directly to Hegel's most critical philosophical observation about China. He believed that people completely lacked subjective interiority.
Subjective interiority.
Yes.
It sounds like he's claiming they didn't have conscious thoughts, which obviously can't be what he meant.
No, he wasn't denying their humanity or their intellect. Subjective interiority, in his framework, refers specifically to an autonomous moral conscience.
Like an internal compass?
Yes, but one that exists apart from the state, and crucially, one that can be positioned against the state.
Oh, I see.
It is the recognized philosophical right to question authority based on your own internal morals. The capacity to say, the law dictates X, but my conviction dictates Y, and therefore the law is unjust.
It's the mechanism of societal rebellion.
Exactly.
To keep the family analogy going, subjective interiority is the moment the teenager realizes their parents are fallible.
That's a perfect analogy.
The teenager develops their own worldview and pushes back, creating friction in the household.
And that friction is everything to Hegel. He believed that in China, that societal teenage rebellion simply never occurred.
Because the emperor's will was absolute.
Right. The concept of freedom was a total monopoly held exclusively by the despot. Everyone else was absorbed into this vast matrix of ritual and custom.
So because there was no recognized right to push back, there was no internal tension.
And in Hegelian philosophy, without internal tension, you have no engine for historical progress.
Okay, I have to pause and challenge Hegel's empirical grasp of reality here.
Go for it.
Because anyone looking at Chinese history prior to 1820 sees a civilization that was anything but frozen.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, we're talking about a society that engineered the Grand Canal, an unprecedented feat of engineering.
Absolutely massive.
They developed complex, meritocratic, bureaucratic systems. They produced devastatingly sophisticated moral philosophy, invented paper money.
Managed an economy that dwarfed Europe during the Song dynasty.
Right. How does a philosopher look at the invention of gunpowder, the compass, and movable type and conclude, yes, this society is stationary?
It is a totally valid challenge, and it requires us to understand how narrowly Hegel defined history.
Okay, how did he define it?
For him, a timeline of events or technological inventions or dynastic successions that does not constitute history in the philosophical sense.
So it's not just a ledger of things happening.
No. World history, for Hegel, is the active, painful unfolding of freedom through dialectical stages.
Ah, the famous dialectic. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Exactly. That is the mechanism we need to focus on. You start with a baseline condition, the thesis.
Right.
Eventually, that condition generates its own internal contradiction. It's opposite the antithesis.
The friction.
Yes, the resulting friction between the two forces the society to break through into a new, elevated state.
Which is the synthesis.
Hegel viewed world history as this ladder climbing toward absolute freedom.
Okay.
It begins in the East with substantial unity, where only one person is free. It progresses to the Greco-Roman world, where some are free.
And then it culminates in Europe.
Specifically, the modern Germanic and Christian world, where he believed the framework existed for all to be free.
Wow. So when he looked at the Grand Canal or the intricate Confucian bureaucracy, he didn't deny they existed.
Not at all.
He just categorized them as quantitative achievements, not qualitative philosophical leaps.
Exactly. He viewed them as magnificent administrative tools designed to maintain the thesis, rather than challenge it.
To keep the peace.
Right. The entire goal of the Confucian order was harmony. It prioritized moral cultivation specifically to ensure stability under the imperial mandate.
So it was a system architected to absorb shocks, to prevent the very friction Hegel thought was mandatory for progress.
It was a shock absorber, not an engine. The system was meticulously designed to prevent what he called restless self-overcoming.
Okay, so without an internal contradiction potent enough to spark a rupture, Hegel was forced by his own logic to categorize China as structurally stationary.
Yes. It wasn't merely a lack of historical awareness on his part. It was a fundamental requirement of his system. If a society suppresses the antithesis, it cannot synthesize. It's frozen.
This forces a really profound question about how we fundamentally evaluate civilizations.
Also,
Well, we in the modern West are deeply conditioned to view disruption and constant reinvention as synonymous with progress.
oh, absolutely. Move fast and break things.
Exactly. But if you have a system engineered to maintain stability and continuity across millennia, it might look at our celebrated disruption and diagnose it as mere chaos.
That tension is fascinating. And it leads us to an amazing historical test case.
The anomalies.
Right. Because if Hegel's entire premise rests on the idea that China lacked the internal drive to disrupt the status quo, we have to examine the moments when they seemingly did exactly that.
And the most glaring anomaly in the historical record, the moment the stationary clock seemingly strouted gears and tried to move on its own, brings us to the Ming dynasty.
And the absolutely staggering story of Admiral Zheng He.
The Ming treasure feats represent a chapter of maritime history that almost defies comprehension.
They operated primarily between 1405 and 1433.
To give this some scale for you, the listening, we are talking about the early 15th century. This is decades before Christopher Columbus or Vasco da Gama even began their voyages.
Way before.
The Ming dynasty commissions an armada that makes the European age of exploration look like a regatta of rowboats.
It really does.
The source documents describe the treasure ships, the Daxuan, as the largest wooden vessels ever constructed. We're talking about ships featuring up to 9 masts, spanning over 400 feet in length.
Equipped with advanced watertight compartments and celestial navigation tools.
Yeah. By comparison, Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria, was roughly 60 feet long.
You could essentially use the deck of a Ming treasure ship as a dry dock for the entire fleet that discovered the Americas.
That is just wild to wrap your head around. And this wasn't just a solitary exploratory vessel. Wang, he commanded fleets consisting of hundreds of ships.
Carrying nearly 30,000 personnel.
Diplomats, military battalions, astronomers, botanists, medical officers, just a floating city.
They projected the power of the Ming court across the South China Sea, through the Indian Ocean, reaching the Arabian Peninsula, and all the way down the eastern coast of Africa.
Okay, so on the surface, this historical event completely shatters Hegel's framework.
It seems to, yes.
It looks like the ultimate manifestation of outward projection, dynamic action, restless expansion.
Exactly the kind of stuff that drove European historical development.
It looks like the clock acting as a spaceship,
Yeah.
centuries ahead of schedule. So how does Hegelian philosophy survive this data point? Does the dialectic just collapse here?
The irony is that a Hegelian scholar would look at the Ming treasure fleets and use them to definitively prove the stationary thesis.
Wait, really? How?
The key lies not in the size of the ships, but in the motivation for their construction. And crucially, the reasons for their destruction.
Okay, let's look at the motivation first.
Think about European exploration. It was largely driven by a collision of independent forces. You had an emerging merchant class desperate for spice routes.
Intense competition between rival nation states.
And a religious mandate to proselytize. It was deeply systemic.
But the Ming voyages, in stark contrast, were almost entirely the product of imperial caprice.
Yes, they were initiated by the Yongle Emperor. He was a ruler who had usurped the throne and was deeply concerned with projecting legitimacy and overwhelming majesty. He bypassed the traditional Confucian bureaucracy entirely and entrusted this massive undertaking to his inner circle of loyal eunuchs, led by Zheng He.
So this circles right back to the patriarchal theocratic principle.
Exactly.
The voyages didn't emerge from a structural economic shift or a societal antithesis. They happen simply because the ultimate patriarch willed them into existence.
Furthermore, their mission parameters were completely different from European colonialism.
They weren't looking for colonies.
No, they were not seeking to conquer territory, establish settler colonies, or violently extract resources. The texts emphasize that their primary function was the bestowal of blessings.
Bestowal of blessings. That sounds very harmonious.
They established tributary relationships, exchanged exotic goods, and demanded ritual recognition of the Ming emperor as having the mandate of heaven.
They were projecting the existing cosmic order outward, not seeking to discover a new one.
Precisely.
It really reminds me of a modern billionaire funding a wildly expensive vanity space tourism project.
Oh, that's a brilliant comparison.
Right. They build a colossal rocket, they achieve orbit, they prove they possess the technological supremacy. But there is no underlying economic ecosystem driving it.
It's not a sustainable business.
Exactly. And the very moment that billionaire steps down, or the board faces a budget crisis, the entire space program is instantly scrapped. Because the core business model never actually required going to space.
That analogy maps perfectly onto the political aftermath of the Voyages.
What happened?
Following the death of the Yongle Emperor, the political winds in the Ming court shifted violently. The Confucian scholar officials who were the ideological rivals of the eunuchs regained their dominance.
And they hated the fleets, didn't they?
They viewed them as an abhorrent, destabilizing waste of agricultural resources.
And their reaction wasn't merely to defund the program. They actively erased it from the hardware of the civilization.
They dismantled the dry docks, they burned the navigational logs and shipbuilding blueprints.
They burned the blueprint.
They instituted strict maritime bans, making it a capital offense to construct a ship with more than 2 masts. Wow.
They violently wrestled the civilization back to its foundational principles: agrarian self-sufficiency, inward focus, and continental defense against the nomadic tribes to the north, which eventually led to the massive expansion of the Great Wall.
Right.
So the system detected an anomaly, a massive outward-facing expenditure of energy, and triggered a ruthless immune response to return the organism to stasis.
By destroying the fleets, the Ming court demonstrated that the underlying software of the society, the Confucian orthodoxy, was far more powerful than any temporary technological leap.
The system successfully neutralized its own potential for change.
Which means when Hegel is sitting in his study in Berlin in the 1820s, analyzing the Qing dynasty.
He is observing the result of a deliberate, centuries-long policy of isolation.
Exactly. He saw a civilization that had intentionally pulled up the drawbridge. His diagnostic error was assuming that this specific policy phase was an eternal cultural essence.
He assumed the gears were physically fused together, rather than acknowledging that the operators had just engaged a massive parking brake.
That's it. But within the strict confines of his logic, he wasn't entirely wrong about the mechanism of change.
How so?
Well, if a civilization's internal architecture is so robust that it can effortlessly dismantle its own greatest technological achievements just to maintain harmony.
Then internal evolution is functionally impossible.
Right. The thesis is too strong. It suffocates the antithesis in the crib.
Which means, if the engine of history cannot be built from the inside, it must be violently imported from the outside.
This is the dark, chillingly predictive power of Hegel's dialectic. It dictates that a closed, stationary system can only be propelled into the next stage through a massive external rupture.
The door cannot be unlocked. It must be blown off its hinges.
And the explosives arrived on the coast of China just a few years after Hegel's death.
This leads us directly into the period the sources identify as the arrival of Western fire, specifically the Opium Wars.
The first Opium War erupted in 1839, followed by the second in 1856. The mechanics of this conflict are infamous.
Yeah, let's unpack that, because it's pretty brutal.
The British Empire was facing a massive trade deficit due to its insatiable demand for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. So they effectively transformed themselves into a state-sponsored narcotic cartel.
They flooded southern China with opium grown in India.
And when the Qing government attempted to enforce its laws and seize the contraband to protect its people, the British responded with overwhelming military force.
We have to emphasize the sheer ontological shock of this conflict. This wasn't just a border skirmish between roughly equal powers.
Not at all.
The British arrived with the vanguard of the Industrial Revolution. Steam-powered, iron-hull gunboats like the HMS Nemesis.
Capable of navigating shallow rivers against the wind.
Armed with modern explosive artillery. They were obliterating wooden war junks and coastal fortresses that had remained technologically unchanged for centuries.
It was an encounter that instantly laid bare a staggering technological chasm. The illusion of the unassailable Middle Kingdom was just shattered by industrialized violence.
Now, framing this through the Hegelian lens requires a certain level of intellectual detachment, because Hegel would not view this simply as a cynical resource grab by a drug cartel.
He absolutely would not. To a Hegelian, the British gunboats were merely the physical carriers of a much larger metaphysical force.
The world spirit again.
Yes. Hegel argued that the world spirit, the unfolding consciousness of rationality, had currently inhabited the Germanic and Christian world.
Okay.
Therefore, the brutal bombardment of Chinese ports was interpreted as the world spirit forcefully injecting modern rationality and scientific methodology into a stagnant system.
It is a deeply disturbing philosophy when you see it applied to real human suffering.
It really is.
It rationalizes colonial violence as a necessary slaughter bench of history,
Yeah.
required to drag a childhood civilization into adulthood.
It's a brutal framework, without question. But the historical sources confirm that this external shock accomplished exactly what the dialectic predicted.
It forced a reaction.
The stationary system was cracked open, and a cascade of what Hegel would term rational universality began to flood in.
The King Court realized they could no longer rely on Confucian morality to repel artillery shells.
Right. And this realization triggers an intense period of ideological scrambling, beginning with the self-strengthening movement in the late 19th century.
The King officials realized they desperately needed the Western fire, the steam engines, the arsenals, the telegraph lines.
But they were terrified of the philosophical payload that came attached to those technologies.
Which is perfectly captured in the defining motto of the movement. Let me get this right. Zongxu Wei Ti, Zixui Wei Yang.
Yes, which translates to Chinese learning as substance, Western learning for practical use.
It is a brilliant, desperate strategic formula. They were attempting a surgical strike on Western knowledge.
Exactly. They wanted to import the mathematical formulas for ballistics and metallurgy, but they wanted to strictly quarantine the political philosophies.
Democracy, individual rights, the scientific method.
The very things that had actually birthed those technologies.
They wanted to download the new software applications without updating the fundamental operating system of the empire.
They wanted the gears to turn, but they still wanted the clock to remain a shrine to the patriarchal theocratic principle.
But, as any historian of science will point out, technology is not ideologically neutral.
Not at all.
You cannot adopt the scientific method, which relies on relentless falsification and questioning established dogma, and expect your brightest minds to turn around and unconditionally accept the absolute authority of a monarch.
The epistemology of science inherently corrodes the epistemology of divine right.
The software eventually demands a new motherboard.
That's a great way to phrase it. And when the self-strengthening movement failed to prevent further defeats, most notably to a modernized Japan in 1895, that cognitive dissonance became unbearable.
The realization that you cannot separate the technology from the underlying philosophy brings us to an intellectual earthquake, the May 4th movement in 1919.
Following the collapse of the imperial system in 1911, Chinese intellectuals looked at the fractured state of the new republic and realized the surgical strike had failed.
Importing mere tools was insufficient.
The May 4th movement famously galvanized around two specific demands, personified as Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy.
They weren't just asking for better gunboats anymore. They were explicitly demanding the Hegelian concept of subjective interiority.
They were demanding the right of the individual citizen to exercise critical thought and to actively participate in governance.
This is the profound turning point. The cultural elite actively recognized that the old thesis had to be dismantled.
This openness, this desperate search for a functional modern operating system, ultimately paved the way for the arrival of the most consequential ideological import of the 20th century,
Marxism.
which arrived via the newly formed Soviet Union.
Let's pause and look at the sheer scale of this intellectual importation. Over the course of a century, China is forced to grapple with and adopt the scientific method, industrial capitalism, the rights-bearing citizen, and finally, Marxism-Leninism.
None of which grew organically out of traditional Chinese thought.
Right. They were all, as the sources emphasize, brutal, unoptional imports injected via the trauma of the Opium Wars.
And this is where Hegel's ghost seems to stand vindicated.
A strict Hegelian observer looks at this sequence and concludes that the system worked exactly as described.
The Oriental principle proved structurally incapable of internal evolution. The essential ingredients for modernity had to be supplied entirely from the outside.
The world spirit literally kicked the door down.
If we stop the tape right there, Hegel's map looks flawless.
But if the story actually ended there, modern China would merely be a passive recipient of history.
It would be a hollowed-out, colonized replica of Western development.
Just running a buggy version of European software. And anyone observing the global landscape today knows that is absolutely not what happened.
They didn't just passively accept the Western fire. They absorbed it, dismantled it, and used it to construct an entirely new kind of furnace.
To understand the mechanics of this furnace, we have to fast forward through the immense turbulence of the mid-20th century, the World Wars, the Civil War.
We land in December 1978. Deng Xiaoping initiates the policy of reform and opening up.
And the scale of what happens next is arguably without precedent in human economic history.
It is the largest and most rapid industrial scaling ever recorded. The state orchestrates a massive, calculated influx of Western knowledge.
They send students abroad, they import turnkey factories.
They invite foreign capital in, but strictly on terms dictated by the state, forcing technology transfers as the price of market entry.
I used the software analogy earlier, but to update it for 1978, it's as if a legacy mainframe computer downloads a massive operating system upgrade designed by a completely different manufacturer.
Why all conventional logic, the system should crash.
But instead, the legacy hardware somehow optimizes the foreign code, recompiles it, and runs it at speeds that terrify the original programmers.
To understand how they managed this without civilizational collapse, the historical sources direct us to look at China's deeper historical patterns.
While Hegel was fixated on their stationary appearance, he missed their profound historical superpower.
Their capacity to absorb foreign concepts, metabolize them, and synthesize them into something uniquely Chinese.
The classic example the source gives is Buddhism.
Right. Yes. Buddhism does not originate in China. It travels there from India via the Silk Road.
But it doesn't remain a static foreign import.
Chinese philosophers aggressively engage with it, cross-pollinate it with native Taoist concepts, and completely transform it into Chan Buddhism,
which later exports to Japan and becomes Zen. They didn't just adopt the religion, they rewrote its DNA.
They performed the same metabolic process with technology. Even when early forms of the compass or gunpowder appeared elsewhere, it was within the Chinese framework that they were refined and scaled.
So when we look at the post-1978 era, we are watching this ancient metabolic engine process Western science and market economics.
Precisely. They took foundational Western breakthroughs, Newtonian physics, semiconductor physics, and executed them on a massive scale.
Look at high-speed rail. They import the initial train sets from German and Japanese firms.
But they don't just act as a passive customer.
No. They reverse engineer the rolling stock, adapt the engineering for extreme climates, and within 2 decades, they lay down a domestic high-speed rail network that accounts for over 2/3 of the total track on the planet.
They took the Western gear and hooked it up to a massive civilizational amplifier.
The same process applies to aerospace, lunar sample return missions, quantum communication satellites.
All relying on foundational quantum mechanics developed in Europe, but realized through Chinese state mobilization.
This brings us to the crucial question of the motherboard. What was the institutional scaffolding that allowed them to scale these imported technologies so aggressively?
The geopolitical white papers argued that the indispensable architecture for this was the Chinese Communist Party's Leninist command structure.
Which presents just a brain-breaking irony.
It really does.
To build a system capable of maximizing Western science and capitalist market forces, they utilize a governing architecture, Marxism-Leninism, which is itself an imported Western ideological product.
It is a staggering synthesis. The Ming emperors, for all their power, lacked this specific kind of institutional machinery.
They relied on dynastic cycles and personal whim.
The modern Leninist state, however, operates on rigid, multi-decade planning horizons, 5-year plans directing massive surges of state capital.
They employ the doctrine of military-civil fusion, erasing the barrier between commercial research and defense applications,
allowing the state to instantly leverage civilian breakthroughs for geopolitical power.
They literally took a 19th century European critique of capitalism, weaponized it as an organizational tool, and used it to turbocharge a 5,000-year-old civilization.
Which brings us to the present moment and the culmination of this immense historical arc.
We've seen Hegel's thesis, the stationary Oriental principle. We've tracked the violent antithesis, the injection of Western rationality.
Now we are looking at the Hegelian synthesis. the modern Chinese state.
Let's summon the ghost of Hegel again. He materializes today and looks at a civilization that absolutely dominates global supply chains, manufactures the vast majority of EV batteries, and dictates 5G architecture.
He looks at a leader, Xi Jinping, who frequently utilizes classical rhetoric, speaking of a community of shared future for mankind.
That rhetoric is deeply resonant with history. It sounds remarkably like the bestowal of blessings that defined his Voyages.
But this time, it is backed by a blue water navy churning out guided missile destroyers and the digital infrastructure of the Belt and Road Initiative.
How does Hegel process this? Does he admit defeat? Does he acknowledge that the stationary clock built a better engine than Europe did?
Hegel's philosophical architecture is notoriously resilient. He wouldn't see this as a refutation. He would see it as a spectacular confirmation of the dialectic.
Wait, how?
He would observe that the core Oriental principle, the belief that the state is the absolute substance and collective harmony supersedes individual autonomy, has not been erased.
It's still there.
It has simply been armed with the most lethal and efficient instruments of European rationality.
The underlying logic is the same, but the avatars have been upgraded. Let's map it out. In this new synthesis, the role of the infallible emperor
is occupied by the vanguard party.
The strict behavior-modifying rituals of Confucianism
Are replaced by socialist ideology, digital surveillance, and party discipline.
and those magnificent but ultimately fragile wooden treasure fleets.
Are now carrier strike groups, the Tiangong space station, and hyperscale data centers.
The crucial distinction being that the modern outward projection is no longer fragile. Zheng He's fleets could be burned in a shipyard because they were an anomaly.
The Belt and Road Initiative is woven into the fabric of global macroeconomics.
They have achieved permanence through the metabolization of Western mechanics. So we have to ask the ultimate question. If we're playing by Hegel's rules, does this mean China has won the dialectical game? Have they reached the summit of world history?
And this is where Hegel's ghost delivers his final stubborn verdict. He would look at the quantum tech, the lunar rovers, the GDP, and he would say, no.
No! How can he possibly look at a civilization outscaling the West and say they haven't achieved the synthesis?
Because we have to remember how Hegel defines the ultimate goal of history.
Freedom, right?
Yes, for him, progress is not measured in megawatts of power or silicon chip yields. The entire tellus of history is the realization of absolute freedom.
Okay.
To occupy the final stage of world history, a civilization must achieve the perfect reconciliation between objective state power and subjective individual freedom. The autonomous moral conscience of the citizen must be fully recognized and integrated, not merely managed or suppressed.
And because the modern Chinese system still operates on a fundamentally collective logic, where individual rights are often subordinated in service of the state.
Exactly. From a strict Hegelian perspective, the core contradiction remains unresolved.
So he would recognize them as a terrifyingly formidable geopolitical power.
He'd classify it as a vastly higher iteration of the Oriental principle, but he would absolutely refuse to recognize it as the final embodiment of the world spirit.
It's as if they built a hypercar capable of breaking the sound barrier, and Hegel is standing on the track with a stopwatch saying, very impressive engineering, but you are still driving on the wrong ideological track.
He would argue they're driving a vehicle built from European parts, using it to drive backward toward an older destination of absolute state unity. He'd claim this is still just Europe's dialectic, relocated.
I have to say, that sounds like an incredible amount of intellectual coping from a 19th century philosopher.
He really does, doesn't it?
It feels like the ultimate moving of the goalposts. Sure, you have the biggest navy, but according to my highly specific Eurocentric definition of freedom, you still don't count.
It absolutely exposes the boundary conditions of his philosophy. And this brings us to the most vital realization of our deep dive. We have to break Hegel's map.
We have to ask if a conceptual framework designed in 1820s Berlin is actually capable of parsing the reality of a 21st century multipolar world.
The source texts make a very compelling argument that Hegel's system is brilliant at explaining the mechanism of historical trauma.
The idea that a violent external catalyst shatters stasis.
The Opium Wars perfectly validate that mechanism, but his system catastrophically fails to predict the outcome of that adaptation.
Because he conceptualized civilizations as closed, linear loops.
In his view, a lower civilization could only upgrade by being totally subsumed and replaced by a higher European stage.
But modern network theory shows us that civilizations are actually incredibly complex, open, adaptive systems. Modern China did not become a European state.
They didn't overwrite their code, they compiled a completely novel hybrid.
It is neither purely the Oriental stasis Hegel described, nor is it the liberal European end state he predicted. It's a third thing entirely.
They took the tools of Western modernity and redirected them toward a completely unique civilizational project.
One focused on collective rejuvenation rather than individual emancipation.
What truly breaks the Hegelian map is that this new hybrid is not content to simply exist within its own borders. It is now actively radiating its own standards back out into the world.
When Beijing exports 5G architecture, or sets the technical standards for electric vehicle supply chains,
they are actively reshaping the global operating system.
they are no longer the passive recipient of the world's spirit. They are driving the narrative.
Hegel's linear ladder of history simply cannot compute a scenario where the childhood civilization absorbs the tools of the adult and then creates a new paradigm that actively displaces the adult.
It forces us to abandon the idea of a single, deterministic timeline. There is no inevitable unfolding of some abstract world spirit.
The trajectory of the 21st century comes down to raw human agency.
It comes down to the pragmatic choices being made right now by policymakers and engineers in Beijing, Washington, Brussels, and New Delhi.
It is about how different civilizations manage to share the same physical planet without triggering a catastrophic system failure. We are off the edge of his map.
Which brings our deep dive full circle. We have traversed an epic, centuries-long diagnostic journey today.
We really have.
We started by looking at Hegel's blueprint of a frozen, stationary empire, a clock trapped in a patriarchal loop, seemingly devoid of friction.
We analyzed the fleeting, anomalous outward projection of the Ming treasure fleets.
And how the system ruthlessly suppressed its own technological marvels to maintain harmony.
We then charted the massive, traumatic external shock of the Opium Wars, the brutal injection of Western rationality that finally shattered stasis.
And we tracked the staggering metabolic process that followed, a process where an ancient civilizational framework absorbed that Western fire.
Utilizing imported Leninist scaffolding to optimize imported capitalist mechanics.
Creating a uniquely modern, unimaginably powerful hybrid. The wooden ships of Zheng He are indeed sailing again, but this time they are powered by nuclear propulsion, guided by quantum-encrypted satellite links.
Backed by a relentless industrial base that refuses to be dismantled. The stationary clock didn't just get a spaceship engine, it built a fleet of them.
It fundamentally re-engineered the nature of global power. But before we sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thread to pull on. A concept that builds on the very dialectic we've been deconstructing today.
Okay, let's hear it.
If Hegel's philosophy dictates that a stationary system can only be propelled forward by a massive external shock, and if China successfully absorbed the shock of the Western fire to synthesize into a radically new hybrid, what happens when this new hybrid becomes the external shock to the rest of the globe?
That is precisely the structural inversion that defines our current geopolitical era.
Right. If Western nations are now finding themselves forced to rapidly react, adapt, and restructure their own economies to deal with the technological standards radiating from Beijing, the roles of the dialectic have completely flipped.
They absolutely have.
We have to ask ourselves, who is acting as the catalyst now? And perhaps more unsettlingly, who is in danger of becoming the new stationary civilization? It's a question that requires us to look at our own blueprints with a very critical eye. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the mechanics of history, and we will catch you next time.